Okay, so let's dive in. We're heading deep into the rainforest of Papua, Indonesia today, a place that still feels, really mysterious, very isolated.
And we're focusing on the people who live there, the Korowai, sometimes called the Kolufo.
Right. And the sources we've got, they mentioned some interesting names the Korowai use for themselves. What were they again?
Yeah, Kolufo Fumanap or Kolufo Yanap.
And that name actually tells you something, doesn't it? The sources break it down.
They do. Kluso or Kolufo, that just means people.
Mm-hmm.
But the second part, Fumanap or Yanap.
Means walking on leg bone.
Exactly. Which, according to the material, is how they distinguish themselves from neighboring groups who travels more by water. It kind of grounds them immediately in the forest.
Yeah, emphasizes that connection to the land, or maybe, well, what's above the land in their case.
Good point. So that's what this deep dive is all about. We're digging into the sources you've shared, all the research, the notes, and trying to pull out the key insights.
Mm-hmm. Basically giving you, our listener, a shortcut to understanding the Korowai. Their really unique culture, life up in the trees, and yeah, we need to talk about some of the more controversial claims too.
Definitely. And when you think Korowai, the first image is usually those tree houses, right? The sources call them some of the world's last true tree dwellers.
They build them incredibly high up.
Seriously high. We're talking about selecting these huge bennu trees and building, the sources say, hundreds of feet off the ground.
Wow. So why? Why go to all that effort, build so high? What do the sources say?
Well, it's not just one single reason. It seems to be a mix of things. Practicality comes into it, escaping mosquitoes, which must be intense down there.
I can only imagine.
And also defense. Getting up high gives you an advantage if there's conflict with rival groups.
Makes sense. A natural fortress.
But maybe even more important, or at least just as important, is the spiritual side. The sources mention protection from these things they call loleo, evil spirits.
Ah, okay. So the height is physical safety and spiritual safety. These houses are more than just structures.
Absolutely. They're central to their way of life. And daily life goes on up there. The sources talk about how they survive.
Hunter-gatherers, mostly?
Primarily, yes. Hunting wild pigs seems important. Gathering their staple food, which is sago, that comes from a type of palm. And fishing, too.
Plus some horticulture, right?
Yeah.
Shifting cultivation.
Exactly. They're incredibly self-sufficient, really tied into the forest ecosystem.
There was also that detail about smoking.
Oh, yeah, the Dupont Nagel,
Yeah.
a traditional bamboo pipe.
And they use FIOP shavings as a filter, apparently. Smoking tobacco is traditional.
But interestingly, the sources note no alcohol, traditionally, just that specific custom with tobacco. It's these little details that paint a picture.
Okay, so shifting from the physical environment, what about their society? How are they organized?
The sources describe a society based on small family clans. Leadership isn't really formal, like having a chief.
No chiefs. So how does it work?
It's more about individuals they call big men. Their influence comes from personal qualities, respect they've earned, that sort of thing, not an institution.
Interesting. And the sources mention conflict sometimes.
Yeah, interclan warfare.
Yeah.
And apparently it often stems from beliefs about witchcraft and sorcery. That really shows how deeply those beliefs are woven into everything, even conflict.
And their family structure, their kinship, is quite detailed too, according to the material.
Very. The Patra clan is the core unit. The anthropological term used is Omaha eye pattern, which basically maps out specific relationships and terms for relatives.
So it dictates who's who and how you relate to them.
Pretty much.
Cool.
It includes things like institutional levirate, where a widow might marry her late husband's brother.
Okay.
And there are important roles for maternal uncles, specific avoidance rules with certain in-laws. It's a complex system.
Definitely sounds structured. What about marriage itself?
Exogamous, meaning they marry outside their own clan. And polygynous, so men can have more than one wife.
And there was a specific preference mentioned.
Yeah, the sources note a preference for marrying a classificatory mother's brother's daughter. It shows a very defined approach to creating family ties and alliances.
Right. And all this social structure exists within a very spiritual world.
Absolutely. The sources say their universe is full of spirits. They seem to have reverence for a creator god, Gammiji, described as red-headed.
And also a concept of honoring their one god.
Yeah, that term appears too, suggesting maybe different layers to their understanding of the divine. It's complex.
And this spirituality plays out in rituals, obviously.
Big time. The sources mention a Sago Grub Festival. Apparently it's a huge deal, maybe only happens once in a lifetime for a clan.
What's the purpose?
Prosperity, fertility for the community.
Mm-hmm.
And they also sacrifice pigs, domesticated ones, to ancestor spirits, especially if there's trouble. seeking help, or appeasement.
So a constant interaction with the spirit world and ancestors.
Seems like it. And this links to their beliefs about death, too. The sources mention a kind of reciprocal reincarnation.
How does that work?
The idea is someone who dies can be sent back from the land of the dead by their relatives there
Yeah.
to be reborn in a baby within their own clan.
Wow, so a continuous cycle within the family line.
Exactly. And all this knowledge, myths, stories, rules, everything, it's passed down orally.
Makes sense. A rich oral tradition. Folktales, sayings, charms, totems. Crucial when there wasn't a written language historically.
And speaking of language, the sources do identify it. It belongs to the Ayu Dumit family, part of the bigger Trans-New Guinea group.
And remarkably, despite the isolation, there's now a dictionary and grammar.
Yeah, that's a sign of more recent contact and study. The sources don't go deep into trade networks, but they do mention gender roles, like women typically processing sago, men handling key ceremonies.
Okay, so for centuries, maybe millennia, they were largely cut off. That isolation is hard to fathom.
It really is. That rainforest was like a fortress. But contact eventually happened. The sources give us a specific date for the first documented Western scientific encounter.
Which was?
March 17th to 18th, 1974. An expedition with Van Arsdale, Mitten, Grundhofer.
What happened during that first contact?
They met about 30 Korowai men near the upper island and river. It was mainly observation, noting things like how they made fire, gathering a basic word list, just initial contact.
And that opened the floodgates, so to speak.
Well, gradually, Dutch Protestant missionaries started living nearby in the late 1970s. Then an Indonesian anthropologist, Dia Sudarman, made films in the 80s.
Bringing them more to outside attention.
Definitely. And then more film crews. 1993, there was one documenting a Smithsonian study.
What was that study about?
It looked at treehouse building, but also, and this is important, aspects of cannibalism, framed as a form of criminal justice in their system. That research ended up in the film Lords of the Garden.
Right. And the missionary presence grew.
Yes, a local Christian community started in '96, though initially it was mostly neighboring Korowai people. Korowai themselves were apparently resistant at first.
But some eventually converted.
Yeah. By the late 90s, the first Korowai baptisms happened, and then Bible translators arrived in 2003. So that influence deepened.
And the media kept coming.
Oh, yeah. 2006, Paul Raphael, a tour guide, brought Australia's 60 Minutes. Then the BBC's First Contact documentary in 2007.
That one had some pretty striking footage, didn't it?
It did, from a 1999 encounter. The Korowai were clearly disturbed, calling the filmmakers white ghosts, thinking the world might be ending. It shows the shock of that contact.
And the BBC came back later, too.
For Human Planet in 2011. That's when they actually commissioned the building of that super high 35-meter treehouse specifically for the documentary.
Commissioned. We'll come back to that.
And even YouTube got involved.
Yep. 2019, best ever food review show. Made contact, ate some local food. It just shows the ongoing and maybe increasing level of outside interaction.
Okay, so all this media attention inevitably leads us to the most sensational topic associated with the Korowai, cannibalism.
Right. The sources definitely acknowledge that this has been recorded, even relatively recently, and that early contact and documentaries made it widely known.
But the crucial thing here, based on the sources, is why it happened, if and when it did. It wasn't about food, was it? Absolutely not about hunger or random violence. The material is clear. It was tied into their specific spiritual beliefs and their system of justice.
It was targeted.
Exactly. Targeted at individuals they identified as kakwa.
And a kakua, according to their belief system described in the sources, is what?
It's described as an evil witch, a sorcerer, a kind of malevolent entity from outside the clan that causes death secretly. The belief is that the kakua kills someone by magically consuming their insides while disguised as a normal person.
So if someone died suddenly, unexpectedly,
they'd suspect a kakua was responsible. And the person identified as that kakua, consuming their body, was seen as, well, justice.
A form of spiritual justice.
Yes, a way to avenge the death the kakua caused, and importantly, they believed it allowed them to reclaim the kakua's power to protect the community. It's a really complex belief system.
And as the sources imply, very easy for outsiders to misunderstand or just label without grasping the context.
Definitely. You have to try and see it within their worldview.
So what about today? Is this still practiced? What do the sources suggest?
The consensus among anthropologists who've worked with them, according to the material, is that it's not practiced anymore by the clans who have regular outside contact.
Okay, but then there's this other quite concerning point raised in the sources.
Yeah, the reports that suggest some clans, or maybe individuals within them, have been, well, coaxed or encouraged to keep the idea alive that it's still happening.
Why?
For tourism,
Yep.
basically, perpetuating the myth to attract visitors and media attention.
Which implies what? That recent reports might be staged.
That's the strong implication from the sources, yes, that most, maybe all, recent claims of active cannibalism are likely exaggerations, misinterpretations, or, performances staged for cameras or tourists.
That adds a whole layer of ethical complexity, doesn't it? The impact of sensationalism.
It really does. How a culture's beliefs get twisted and potentially commodified.
So beyond that specific issue, what are the broader impacts of modernity the sources talk about?
Well, increased contact means things like roads pushing closer, logging operations impacting their forest, and just generally more interaction with local markets, Indonesian society as a whole. It's changing their world.
And tourism is a big part of that change. We mentioned it brings in some cash.
It does since the early 90s. Guiding, carrying luggage, performing traditional displays. It provides some income for some individuals.
But it's not all positive.
No. The sources, especially referencing that documentary, My Year with the Tribe, raise flags about potential exploitation and, well, commercialization.
What did that documentary find specifically?
It reported that a whole kind of industry has sprung up around presenting this image of a completely untouched traditional life. And crucially, that some of those incredibly high tree houses you see in films were actually financed by Western film crews.
Wow. Okay. That changes how you might view those images. Financed by outsiders.
Exactly. It complicates that picture of pure tradition. And the Korowai face huge challenges now. Pressure to integrate, losing traditional knowledge, deforestation.
Are there efforts to help them navigate this?
The sources imply there are, yeah.
Yeah.
NGOs, local government trying to find a balance between preserving their culture and, development. But it's clearly a massive challenge.
And some have moved out of the forest?
Since the 80s, yes.
Yeah.
Some populations moved into villages like Yaniruma, Mu, Umbasma, and others listed in the sources.
But that's not a simple solution either.
Apparently not. The sources mention high rates of village absenteeism. People leave the villages for periods.
Why?
Mostly because the villages are often too far from their main food source, the sago palms. It highlights the practical difficulty of just leaving their forest-based life behind entirely.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, what really stands out is first, their incredible ingenuity. Masters of their environment, building those amazing tree houses.
Definitely. And second, the complexity around those cannibalism claims. Understanding it wasn't about hunger, but about kakua and spiritual justice. And crucially, that the sources strongly suggest it's largely stopped among contacted groups, with real concerns now about it being staged for outsiders.
It really underscores that you can't just take sensational headlines at face value. You need to dig into the details, the beliefs, the history, the impact of contact, the challenges they face now.
Absolutely. It's about respecting the complexity of their experience.
So the final thought, building on all this, given the influence of tourism, the reports of staging things for media, the outside financing of iconic structures, what does the future actually look like for the Korowai?
Yeah. How can their culture be understood, respected authentically when there are these powerful forces potentially turning their identity into a commodity?
Yeah.
That's the big question the sources leave us with, isn't it? Leaves you with a lot to think.